Hi, everybody. This is Tuesday. Yesterday on Monday, you were given the story that you should see on the screen and a link in the last slide after some of those videos introducing the idea of artificial intelligence and other things related to science fiction. We are going to spend about 3 days a week this week and then the following 3 weeks, which is like 12 class periods on science fiction as we finish the school year. Predominantly, we'll be looking at short stories and a few poetry examples because of the shortness of time that we have left. And then the remaining 1 day a week will be you doing lit circles starting next week. So if you looked at the schedule for this week on the slide of the agenda, you'll see that on Thursday, I'm going to put out a kind of a video and some notes explaining how lit circles are going to work this year. And the book link has already been pasted into Google Classroom. It's called A Separate Piece by John Knowles as a PDF. So I would suggest starting to read it right now as you have time and get a few chapters into the book by this weekend. And then probably by the end of this week, by Thursday, you're going to have a list that's digital of who your group is going to be, what your jobs are going to be, just like we did the other three rotations on first, second, and third quarter. And then we'll be discussing the options for how to get together and do a Google Meet discussion of like 20 minutes or so with your group members to just touch on some of the highlights. So it's going to be a much shorter discussion than what you did in class, obviously, where each job had to rotate and have like 12 minutes each time, since obviously with vocab, you're not going to be able to play the game. So it's going to be a little bit different about how you're going to have to attach a vocab activity for me. And you're going to have to make it something that the team might be able to do digitally rather than have to have physical materials. So that's going to be a little bit different. So those things will be coming out at the end of the week, but starting to read that book is going to be really useful for you since we're on a tight time frame, so that by the end of next week, you will already be ready to discuss the first third of the book with your group. I will be grading those written materials, as always, as an individual grade. That will be worth, about 30 points unassisted, and there'll be 3 of those grades. This week, we are going to be working on this story that's right in front of you, The Veldt, and you were supposed to have read it for today. It is kind of a lengthier story. I'm going to go through a few highlighted some scenes and some foreshadowing and symbolism, and kind of highlight some sections throughout this text. And then the assignment that you're going to work on both today and tomorrow is a 2-column note assignment where basically you answer discussion questions, and then we can go back over any of them at the end of the week. There will be a Google Meet on Friday where we can go over any questions about lit circles and how they're going to run after I push out all the materials and information on Thursday. So if you have questions about that right now, I want you to kind of hold off a little bit, wait till you watch the video on Thursday and hear all the explanation of the materials. And then if you have questions, we can do that in a Google Meet on Friday. Otherwise, I'm just answering a bunch of questions I will probably already be addressing as a group on Thursday. The best thing to do right now, again, is just to read and start the book A Separate Piece. The 2-column note assignment is going to be due on Wednesday, so you have today and tomorrow to work on it with no new work. There'll be a quiz again on Thursday over this short story, and then again on Thursday, we'll be talking about lit circles, and you'll have the job sheets and everything there for you to start working on that. And Friday, there's no new work. We will have a PEA that will be assigned over the house on Mango Street probably next week, so don't put that book away yet. I just can't get everything in this week with trying to set up lit circles as well. So to start with, if you read the synopsis, or if you, again, at least read the story, you'd realize The Veldt is considered dystopian science fiction, and it's from 1950. Its writer, Ray Bradbury, was an author who often wrote short stories and famous science fiction stories. Many times he often wrote episodes for The Twilight Zone, if you've ever heard of that classic sci-fi television series. In this story, we have a veldt, which the term actually means an African grassland, like a plain or a savanna. And there's no literal Africa in the story, so it is important to kind of know what a veldt is because it's mentioned so many times. Now, the basic premise is that there's this family called the Hadley family, and we have George and Lydia, who are the parents, and then Peter and Wendy, their boy and their daughter. And they live in this Happy Life home, and it's set sometime in some futuristic time period. Now, inside the Happy Life home is a nursery, and a nursery, I think we would think of it like a media room. It's not a baby nursery, but it's a nursery where the kids can change the scene to make it look like in a kind of like a hologram form to be any kind of setting they want it to be, with even the smell and the odor phonics and the sounds, so that they can feel like they're actually in a foreign place and they can use it for imagination and for play. Now, the kids have started to act kind of unusual in the story, and they've been turning the nursery into a veldt, which is the setting of an African grasslands with grazing lions. And the parents are beginning to have this discussion at the beginning of the story that they're concerned about the nursery not responding to the cues, not responding electronically the way it's supposed to, and about how their children are becoming too overly dependent on technology, and that they're considering turning the whole nursery off. So at the beginning, we start with a conversation between the two parents, and they decide that they want to get a psychologist to look at the nursery. The nursery, again, remember, think of like playroom or media room. And they go down to look at the nursery. And I think it's really important that we look at this quote right here about their happy life home. The happy life home is an ironic title because, as we find out throughout the story, their life is not happy. They, like many other people, Americans today, have searched for the best of materialism, the best that money could buy for their children, is what it said. And they bought this expensive house for this time period that cost them $30,000. The house clothed and fed and rocked them to sleep and played and sang and was good for them, as highlighted right here. And if you can see the polysyndeton with the ands between all the actions, all those actions are the things that the house was doing for them: clothing, feeding, rocking, playing, singing. And many of those things you might equate with the way a mother would care for a child. So a mother would sing to a baby, clothe a baby, feed a baby, rock them to sleep in a rocking chair. But in this case, the house is the one that's doing that. And so the author is automatically giving us this idea that the house is like a mother figure to these kids, and it's the one raising them. So they go into the nursery. And as we go down, again, we can see that it's on the setting of a jungle. So we have this idea of heat and the color yellow, which often becomes important as symbolism in the story. Now, we had yellow in a house on Mango Street as a warning, and this is exactly the same. So you can see that, again, we have the hot yellow sun mentioned right here, and yellow is mentioned a lot. And again, we have the smell of grass, and they're seeing these lions grazing, and they're wondering like why it's always set to Africa. Now, there's also some foreshadowing throughout the story that lets you know that maybe the story is going to have a more sinister theme or idea to it and not necessarily a happy ending. For example, we have vultures that are mentioned in the story. And vultures are birds of prey, and they eat carcasses of other animals, and they're seen as, again, predatory. So there's these vultures that are circling, and they're eating the leftover carcasses that these lions that are supposed to be maybe inside TV screens have been eating, but it just seems very realistic. If you can picture, it's like life-size TV screens, 360 all the way around. And because of the smells and the heat lights beaming on them, the parents feel like they're actually almost there. And they actually start thinking they're hearing screams, which also becomes important later. Now, at that point, again, we have the yellow reference here with the lions. And we have all this imagery about how the lions are going to be so important. And we have here the lions 15 feet away, so feverishly and startlingly real. You could feel the prickling fur on your hand, and your mouth was stuffed with the dusty upholstery smell of their heated pelts. Notice we have the yellow of them was in your eyes, like the yellow of an exquisite French tapestry, the yellow of lions in the summer grass. And then they look at the parents, George and Lydia, with terrible green yellow eyes. Now, they make eye contact with the lions and actually become afraid. And this is a very important detail in the story because the parents begin to feel like the nursery is alive, but they know logically it's just supposed to be like a TV screen. So they actually feel that the lions are bolting at them and are going to be able to reach them. And so they run out of the nursery and slam the door. And again, they're like, oh, that's not really realistic. They just look real, but it's just, again, pretend. But we are able to see at this point in the story that there's some problem with the nursery to the point that the parents are beginning to feel fear. So they decide that they're going to tell their kids that they can't read any more about Africa, that they can't use the African theme on the walls because they feel it's a little bit too violent for their children. And so that's going to be what they tell their kids when they come in. Now, at that point, the mother, I think it's really important, begins to talk about how she's not happy in her happy life home, which I think there's some irony to that because the happy life home was supposed to provide her all these comforts to do everything for you. And we realize that after maybe several years of being in this home, the mother feels that she has no place. The house, like we mentioned before, has become the parent. The house is raising the kids and does everything for them. And the mother feels that she has no connection to her family because there's no use for her. She said she doesn't have enough to do. Why don't we just shut the whole house off for a few days? And her husband asks, you want to fry my eggs and darn my socks and sweep the house? And she says, yes, yes. And he says, I thought that's why we bought it, so we wouldn't have to do anything. And again, her reply is, I feel like I don't belong here. The house is wife and mother and nursemaid. Can I compete with an African Veldt? Can I give a bath and scrub the children as efficiently or quickly as the automatic scrub bath can? I cannot, and it isn't me. You've been nervous too lately. Now, one of the thematic ideas in the story that we begin to see is the idea that technology can often replace the need for people, but in doing so, it often takes out the humanity part of the equation. The mother feels a disconnect in her own house because the technology is doing more than she is, and she feels like she doesn't belong. And that's going to be an important motif as we go through the story. So at this point, the parents are already kind of deciding they want to turn the house off for a little while. Think of that maybe like your parents telling you they want to go technology free, or take your phones, or have everybody put phones away, or not watch TV for a weekend. And these kids, when they come home, are not going to be very happy about this. So let's continue. Again, at this point, they're starting to eat dinner. And Peter and Wendy were at a carnival and they weren't there. And again, it talks about the father thinking about the Jaws and the hot African Veldt, and he thinks he still hears these screams. Now, the screams are foreshadowing. We'll find out a little bit later in the story what they mean, but just keep that in mind. And it explains for a whole paragraph about how there were all these fantastic things like Alice in Wonderland, Dr. Dolittle, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, and different fantastic scenes that the kids had been previously able to play on the nursery walls, but now for some reason they're only fixated on Africa and the Veldt. So again, he goes back to the nursery, stands alone in there, and again tries to change the scene to something that's more peaceful. It's supposed to be voice activated, where if an adult would say, change the nursery to Aladdin and his lamp, for example, it would respond. But then he realizes that nothing is happening, and he believes that the nursery is broken. So there's an important kind of, again, a thematic idea here that technology is sort of starting to take over, and that's often a thematic idea in sci-fi stories. Here, the technology is not responding to the human, and the human's supposed to have the power, but we begin to see that the human is losing his power, and technology has the upper hand. So at this point, we might begin to see in this dystopian sci-fi story that technology is kind of taking on a life of its own. And he cannot control his technology. He cannot make the house change the scene. And he feels that he's losing the power. They begin to go back and talk about their children and how they may have maybe kind of like hacked into the computer system, and maybe they fixated it so that it cannot change back to other scenes. And right then, Peter and Wendy show up. Now, again, I think it's really important to describe the kids. Now, to start with, Wendy and Peter are their children. And to start with, those names should sound very familiar to you because they are allusions to Peter Pan. In Peter Pan, the boy and girl are Peter, Wendy, and Michael, but in this case, it's just Peter and Wendy. And again, Peter and Wendy are known because of the Peter Pan story as being characters who want to stay young or never want to grow up, for example. Again, all these images of candy, marbles, and the holding hands and wanting ice cream and hot dogs gives them the idea that they are these super sweet children, that they are so good, they're so kind, they're holding hands, and they're looking like they are adorable. But what we're supposed to see is this is going to be irony covering up their true lack of morals. So they look sweet, they act respectful, they act like they're kind and loving, but they are indeed not, and they are very sinister children. So the children, again, act like they don't know anything about the nursery, and they don't know why it's on Africa, and they say it's not on Africa. And so the father wants to show them that it's not working. And again, they run down to the nursery, and Peter goes down there, and they get there first. And obviously the children, because they get in the nursery first, are able to change the scene. So by the time the parents get there to show that it's broken, it's been changed to this lovely jungle scene with a fairy named Rima playing a beautiful song, and the dangerous lions are gone. And George Hadley realizes then that he's kind of been duped, and he doesn't understand how. He was not able to change the technology, and he's the adult, but now the kids have the upper hand, and they apparently have this connection or power to the nursery, and they can make it do what they want, and he couldn't, and they're not telling him how it's working, and so he's beginning to feel powerless. So we can also see sort of a slight danger when children start having more power than adults, then things can often become dangerous. So at this point, he sends them to bed. And one other bit of interesting foreshadowing is after the kids go off to bed, he's walking through the nursery and he finds something. And his wife is like, "What did you find?" And he says he found an old wallet that had been his. He picks it up off the ground, and the wallet has teeth marks on it and saliva and some blood. Now, this is the first thing that's been going to show that maybe the lions actually can come through the glass. And that's, of course, not realistic, but this is sci fi and dystopian, because if the wallet had actual teeth marks in it and blood and saliva, it actually shows that it had been touched by something that was not just contained in the walls of the nursery. And he doesn't understand how it got there or why it's his wallet or how it got put in the nursery, but you need to kind of file that away at this point in the story because it's important foreshadowing. So we already know the nursery seems pretty sinister. The children seem kind of sketchy, like they're maybe not as ethical as they appear. They're almost too sweet, and they trick their parents already in this scene, and we don't know why there's screaming going on that they can hear and why the nursery's not responding to the adults. Now, at this point, we go on to the next day, and he actually in the middle of the night, and he and his wife are having trouble sleeping, and they've decided that they've spoiled their children, and that could be another thematic idea for this story. He believes that they've given them everything they want, and because of that, their children have become kind of spoiled and are again not respectful of them. He says, "Children are carpets and should be stepped on occasionally. We've never lifted a hand. They're insufferable. Let's admit it. They come and go whenever they like, and they treat us as if we are the offspring. They're spoiled and we're spoiled." So they begin to realize as parents they need to kind of set more boundaries with their kids. And that's their plan, is to turn off the nursery, to get a psychologist, David McLean, to come out and find out why it's only responding to the kids and not to the adults, and to be able to get the power struggle in the house reorganized so that the kids actually start respecting their parents again and don't take over the control of the house. Now, while they're in bed sleeping, they heard these screams again, and they don't know what they are, but again, it says they sound very familiar. And again, they realize their kids are not in their rooms and they're back and have snuck into the nursery in the middle of the night. And so now we have this other suspicious thing, that besides finding the wallet, there's also still ongoing screaming that sounds very familiar to them, coming from the nursery in the middle of the night. And the parents didn't know what to do and tried to go to sleep for another hour. There's also some significant references here where it says the adults couldn't be rocked to sleep for another hour. Most of the time, it's not adults who are being rocked to sleep. It's babies who are being rocked to sleep. So I think the author is using kind of like that juxtaposition here that's really interesting to show that the adults have no power in the house. So they're treated like babies. No one listens to them. The kids have the upper hand. The nursery doesn't respond to them. It only responds to the kids. They can't enforce the rules. They don't know what's going on, but the kids do. And so they are like babies being rocked to sleep because they are ignorant. Now, the next day, Peter and his father have kind of a conversation that turns into an argument because he accuses him of conjuring up Africa and kind of like hacking into the nursery and making sure that he's not using it correctly. And again, he tells him that we're going to turn it off and for about a month. And of course, Peter's reply is, "That sounds dreadful. Should I have to tie my own shoes and letting the shoe tire do it? Would I have to brush my own teeth and give myself a bath?" So by that quote, we can see how overly dependent the kids have grown on the technology that they can't even use their own imagination or even play without, or even get dressed without somebody doing it for them. Again, the father tells him we're going to turn it off, but notice that Peter's reply is, "I don't think you'd better consider it anymore, father." And he says, "I won't have any threats from my son." I think that's a really important telling scene because the son threatens the father. And it's supposed to be the parent threatening the kid for a consequence. But in this case, again, the children have the upper hand and the parents are somewhat intimidated by these kids. Now, as we continue on in the story, the psychologist comes over and he wants to see the nursery, and he takes them down to the, George Hadley takes them down to the nursery and they watch it. And the psychologist says that he doesn't feel very good about it. He says it's very bad, that he has bad instincts, that there's something's going on and bad feelings about it. His advice is that they tear down the nursery and don't have it in their house anymore and bring in the children every day for therapy for like the next year. And so he believes the kids are having some issues because of the advanced dependence on technology. And so he said that, again, it's caused them to have destructive thoughts. Now, again, at this point, he says a very quote about parenting. Remember, if you remember, Lydia thought she didn't feel useless. Again, he says the room is their father and mother, far more important in their lives than their real parents. So when we think about that in modern day technology, often we could say that phones, video games, things like that become sort of like babysitters to kids. Many of you probably feel like you're so dependent on your device that when your parents take it away, you hate it and you hate your parent, and you would much rather have your phone than have your mom sometimes. So again, we see that in modern society. And remember, this was written in 1950, before iPhones, iPads, internet, streaming, or any of these things that we use regularly. And now we see, as our culture has advanced, sort of that irony that we're actually becoming much more similar to the reality of the story than it was in 1950, when TV had just been invented. This story actually came from the idea and the prediction that Ray Bradbury thought that television would have this kind of an impact on society after it had been around for some time. And TV had just started to come into homes in the 1950s. And now, of course, most of us have 4, 5, 6 TVs in a home, and that's relatively common. So again, the psychologist is saying that the kids are overly dependent on the technology, much like we see in society today, with consequences, because people have too much screen time, too much dependence, lack of interpersonal relationships, depend more on the technology than they do their family members, and maybe interact more digitally than they do in person. All those things have happened and have come true today, which is kind of scary. Okay, so as we go on, again, they turned off the nursery. The children are in hysterics, and they're screaming and throwing a major fit and saying they can't live without the nursery. They want to have it one more time. And as you can see, even the mother kind of caves a little bit, sometimes as parents do, and she thinks the father's being too harsh and wants to give them one more time to go back in the nursery. So again, the kids even tell their parents, "I wish you were dead." And then Lydia tells her husband, "George, just let him give one more time. It won't hurt." And he says, "Okay, if they'll just shut up one more minute, mind you." And then it is turned off forever. Once again, we see that the tantrums of the children have manipulated the parents to caving in on the punishment. If they had only just kept the nursery off at this point, then nothing else would have happened in the story other than just suffering through some angry children. But the parents cave in because they don't want to hear the screaming, and they say, "One more time, you can go into the nursery," and that's going to be a bad decision. So again, they go down to the nursery while the parents are packing because they're about to leave to get out of the house for a while. And they hear their parents calling them, and "Mommy, Daddy, come quick." And so they run down to the nursery, and they're thinking something's wrong. And they run into the nursery, and it's empty. And it's still turned back to Africa again. And all of a sudden they hear a door slam, and they realize they've been locked in the nursery with the lions. Now, if you remember, we also had somewhere in here a scarf that had been shown. I think I skipped that section, but a bloody scarf that had been Lydia's was also found on the floor of the nursery, and previously a bloody wallet with saliva and teeth marks on it. And now we are assuming it's the kids who have locked the parents in their nursery because they wanted to avoid their parents turning it off permanently. And so they have these lions in the walls. And as the reader, you're probably beginning to realize at this point, the lions may actually be able to come through the glass, and maybe they're not just fake lions like a TV screen picture, but they're actually real lions somehow that can cross into the realm and dimension of reality if they've been previously able to put teeth marks and saliva and blood on physical items. So the parents are banging on the door, "Let us out, let us out." And again, they hear Peter say, "Don't let them turn off the house." And so they realize that they've actually been locked in there. And all of a sudden, the lions comes towards them. We have the foreshadowing of the yellow veldt grass, all the ominousness of the rumbling, roaring of the lions. And obviously that single fragment there makes it seem very intimidating that the lions are approaching them. Now, at the very end, the lions appear to attack the parents, and it says that they see them crouching, tails stiff, and they screamed, and they realize why the other screams that they heard at night were familiar. That line is often really confusing, but what seems to be happening is that the kids had planted the scarf and the wallet into the nursery to give the scent to these lions of their parents, one from the mom, one from the dad, so that later they could maybe teach these lions that these are the people they would attack by scent. Additionally, they have been reenacting or envisioning the deaths of their parents, and because it was in another dimension, the TV or the nursery would kind of act out the deaths of their parents in a fake reality, and we would hear the screams, but the real parents were hearing their own screams. So it was foreshadowing that those screams they had heard earlier were actually like fake screams that sounded like them because their children were plotting their death. Now we have to wonder, why would the kids want their parents dead? And the whole reason is the kids have no morals. The kids have been raised by technology, not by humans, so they are void of that empathy and that compassion and that maybe the conscience that comes with humanity. They are much more concerned with keeping their house because remember, the house was considered their mother and the house raised them. So when they feel threatened because the house is going to be turned off, they protect the house over the lives of the adults who are humans because they don't have as much love for their parents as they do for the technology. So of course this is an extreme example, but again, we see, some tendencies today that technology sometimes surpasses the importance of human friendships and relationships in families. So at this point, there's kind of like a space of time right here where we can assume a little bit of time has passed and the parents were eaten by the lions. Now, David McLean is supposed to show up and pick them up, and that's the psychologist, and he shows up at the very end after the parents have already kind of been eaten, and he asks where the parents are, and again they act like they don't know. They're like, oh, they'll be here directly. And he looks at the lions. It looks a little suspicious. They're grazing in the distance. And the point of this is, after they were done feeding, is that they had actually just gotten done eating the parents, but David McLean doesn't realize yet. We also have the shadows and the vultures, which again shows negative connotation, that the vultures are circling above to pick on the carcasses of the parents after the lions are done. And all of this again foreshadows the idea of death, because we have those death connotations that vultures connect to death, the lions connect to death, the feeding connects to death. And so Mr. McLean seems, or Dr. McLean seems to understand that something bad is going on, but he doesn't know what. He just has a bad feeling. And then he looks down at Wendy, and the story ends with her offering him a cup of tea. Now, there's a couple interpretations to that final line. Obviously, it shows a lack of conscience. It shows children who are having a picnic right next to where their parents have been mauled to death by lions, and there's no conscience. They're eating a picnic, they're offering someone tea, and obviously shows no remorse. So I think it's significant that the story ends with a cup of tea, because it shows the cold-heartedness and kind of like that, again, serial killer sociopathic behavior of the kids, because they were raised by technology and void of human compassion and empathy. Some people tend to think that Wendy maybe was going to poison Mr. McLean. And if he drinks the tea, then he'll die as well, because he's the one that would know that maybe they did something to the parents or take them out of the house, and they need to get rid of him as well. So that's also probably inferred that maybe the cup of tea has something to do with how Mr. McLean will also be killed. So that's the end of the story. Kind of tragic and kind of dark, but again, full of lots of imagery, lots of uses of yellow, and the Veldt, again, representing a place of death. And of course, one of our main thematic ideas, it would be sort of like too much technology, or technology to the extreme can be very dangerous. When these kids had access to too much technology, they became spoiled, they became lazy, they became ungrateful, they became violent. And today you can connect those things sometimes to maybe the amount of people playing violent video games, or how much less interaction families have if everybody are on their devices. So again, the author's premise is that technology used by itself is great, but over dependence on it can be a problem and can be a downfall for society and for morality. So that's the end of our first story today. We'll do some discussion in a Google Meet on Friday if you have more questions about it. There's a 2-column note assignment that just has discussion questions that come from this lecture that you need to use the story for to try to fill out. You won't probably get it all done today, so that will continue and also be your assignment on Wednesday, to work on it today and Wednesday, and then turn it in on Wednesday by about 5 p.m. So again, I hope you enjoyed this story. It's one of my favorites. If you need to go back and reread sections of it, because it is a little bit long with 13 pages, again, make sure you read it closely. There is going to be a quiz over it on Thursday also. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions. And you are to post, remember, to the discussion board 1 time today for attendance based on some comment or question about this story, the Veldt. Goodbye.